Good evening, everybody. Welcome to T2 Talks. You know what? It's fantastic to be back, the fourth T2 Talks. And what we've been talking around when we've been building up to this T2 Talks, we've not only got a fantastic speaker lineup, but we wanted to make it the most gritty and edgy and real T2 Talks that there's ever been. We wanted to push the boundaries a little bit. So for my talk this evening, to start off, I'm going to share something with you that not very many people know about me. In fact, this is the first time I will share this on camera. Not so long ago, I was diagnosed with a chronic autoimmune disease called Sjogren's syndrome. Just put your hand up if you've ever heard of Sjogren's syndrome. Exactly, one at the back, Spence. It's a very rare autoimmune disease. It's in the same family as multiple sclerosis and lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. It's chronic. Sjogren's syndrome is a particular autoimmune disease which attacks the moisture-producing glands in the body. So anything in my body that produces moisture, it attacks, and it'll attack the tissues and ultimately destroy them, which causes an array of symptoms. My particular struggles and symptoms with this is I have 30% operation in my tear ducts, so I have chronic dry eyes, which gives me headaches and migraines, dizziness, loss of balance, all of these sensitivity to light and a number of other issues. It dries my mouth. So as a speaker who does this for a living, it's a really challenging thing. It gives me dry mouth, dry nose, it dries my lungs. So at times I struggle to breathe efficiently. It also gives me joint pain, it dries out my joints and it dries out your skin. So you can imagine that it presents some challenges. Now, I don't start by telling you this for sympathy. I seriously don't. There's a few people in the audience who have known me and worked with me for a long time who may be surprised, but I don't tell you it for sympathy. I tell you it because when I'm about to share with you, or when I share with you what I'm about to share with you, you will know that I'm speaking from both my heart and experience. So, what am I going to talk about this evening? I'm going to talk about performance psychology, but in simple terms. Because when we work with a multitude of environments in the military, sport, and in the world of business, we can really whittle down psychology, performance psychology, to two types of mindset. You are either going to be in a challenge or a threat state. Some people in the room have done some work with me who will know what I'm talking about. But you will be in a challenge or a threat state. The difference between the two is this big. But the output on performance is huge, you know, in terms of how we perform. What do I mean by challenge and threat state? Let me just quickly set the scene. A challenge state is when a human being, whether you're in sport, in the workplace, in your personal life, whatever it may be, it's when you are absolutely focused on the positive achievement of a task at hand. You're aware of the consequence, you're aware of failure, of danger, of what might go wrong, of repercussions, but you are absolutely focused on the positive achievement of on the task at hand. Human beings need to be in a challenge state if they're going to perform at their peak. And I'm going to elaborate on this in a short while. So what's a threat state? A threat state in psychology is simply, this clicker's fantastic, Steve. The threat state in psychology is something very slightly different, but a massive change in output. It's when your brain switches and it starts to focus on the consequence of what may happen and the consequence of failing the task at hand, almost eradicating any focus on achieving it. Does this make sense? So in one challenge state, we're focused on what we want to achieve. In the threat state, we shift and we start thinking about what might go wrong or the consequence of what might happen. We're trying to not mess up in a threat state. And I'm going to come back to this in a short while. But the big question is how does our brain do this? And if you are a worrier or you are anxious or you don't deal with pressure very well, this will resonate with you. Your brain, think of your brain like a chemical soup. There are 4 main brain chemicals that impact performance in the workplace or in many other environments, and you need to get familiar with these. In particular, you need to get familiar with one, but let me quickly talk you through them. The first 3 brain chemicals, as you can see behind me on the screen here, are your feel-good chemicals. Dopamine gives you drive, motivation, and ambition. Floods your brain and gives you the desire to do something. Serotonin floods into your brain and it gives you power and influence, and it makes you feel confident. And oxytocin floods your brain when you have trust and rapport with another person and you're building relationships. It's like the love drug. Now, these three chemicals are really important for your well-being. You feel great when you release them, but they are not going to drive challenge or threat state. They're not. They're going to be the result of you achieving something after being in a challenge state. So what drives challenge and threat? Well, the same chemical, cortisol. And anybody of you who have done work with us, we talk about this quite a lot. Cortisol floods your brain to say one of two things. Switch on, this is important, or we are at risk here. But people, this is my biggest point about this talk this evening on challenge and threat state, and I'll link back into why I shared with you about Sjogren syndrome with me. Cortisol is not the baddie. Right? It gives you your fight or flight response, and it wants you to get out of there, or it wants you to be aware of danger and consequence, but it's not the baddie, because how we interpret cortisol is hugely impactful of whether we go into a challenge or a threat state. We've got to make friends with it. We've got to stop worrying about stress, or worrying about worry. We've got to acknowledge that we need cortisol, if we interpret it right, to rise to the challenge. But cortisol will flood your brain in 7.8 seconds, which will say to you, switch on, something is important, or you are at risk. Now, here's how it works in action. In performance psychology, it's all down to control, how in control you are in a situation, and how much stress you release. And if you look at that graphic there, what it's saying is stress is good. You need to release a healthy amount of stress and cortisol to get up there in the performance zone. As long as you control the environment or the outcome, you can perform at your peak. I'm in the performance zone right now. I'm releasing cortisol. As you walked in the room, 160 leaders, 160 people giving up their time to come and listen to us, right? And public speaking is the number one fear. It's the number one fear. We fear judgment, embarrassment, failure. So if I allow it, it can consume me, and I can fastly head to that shutdown zone. But I don't. I understand that I can harness this cortisol and I can rise to the challenge, so I can spend the next 25 minutes or 25 minutes giving you the best possible experience I can. That's challenge state stuff. It's how we interpret it. Let me give you an example of this in action. If I put a tightrope across this room 1 foot off the floor, and I got a volunteer and I asked you to come and walk across that tightrope from one side to the other, would you be able to do it eventually? Yeah? The answer is probably yes. You'd fall off a few times, but you'd get back on and you'd be focused on achievement. Now, if I raise that tightrope 200 meters in the sky from this building to the building across the bridge and ask you to repeat the same exercise, could you do it? No, because your brain switches to now focus on the consequence. You're going in a threat state, and your brain switches to focus on the consequence, which in this case is now death. That's what, the penalty shootout in the World Cup final, 4-3. You're taking the penalty for the team with 4. If you score, you win the World Cup. If you miss, you're still in it. What state are they going to be in? Challenge. Because they're focused on what they need to do, right? You're the penalty taker at 3. If you score, you're still in it. If you miss, you're out the World Cup. What state is that person going to be in? Threat. Which is why we scream at the telly when someone skies a penalty in row Z and we go, you're on 500 million quid an hour. And we can't get our heads around it, useless. It's because they're in a threat state. And when we're in a threat state, cortisol floods our brain. Sensory shutdown happens. Our fine motor skills reduce. You know, this is the impact of a threat state. It's the final story I've got on this is famous golf coach Butch Harmon. Tiger Woods' golf coach. He stood behind another golf coach coaching a golfer. And the golfer's hitting the ball in the water to the right. And the golf coach, who again is probably on £1 million an hour, is saying, you're going right. You're going right. You're going in the water. You need to go left. Don't go right. So Butch Harmon's behind him. He keeps hitting the ball in the water. He says, do you mind if I... He says, yeah, sure, mate. Go in. So he goes really closely behind the golfer. And he says, listen, this is what I want you to do. I want you to move your heel back 2 inches, stick your bum out, and I want you to hit that ball down the middle. And the golfer looks down, he makes an adjustment, and he hits the ball clean down the middle. What happened, this is the point I want to make about the leaders in the room. As well as being in a challenge or threat state yourself, based on what I'm talking about, you carry the greatest influence in putting other people in a challenge or threat state. Butch Harmon, and here's the golden rule of thumb, and if there's one thing you take from my talk this evening, let it be this. When you are leading people, always focus on what you want them to achieve and make it instructional. And stop focusing and communicating on what you want them to avoid. Does that make sense? Too often in the workplace do I see and observe leaders saying, we must not, we cannot afford to miss, we must have, and we're focusing on what we want people to avoid. We are triggering a threat state in our people, unintentionally, because your intention is to drive an outcome. But the golden rule of thumb in challenge state communication is this: always focus on what you want people to achieve and make it instructional. That's what Butch Harmon did. That's why the golfer hit the ball down the middle. Last story on this before we move on and put it all together. I once coached a rugby coach, and he's got a chimp like Caesar from Planet of the Apes, right? So he doesn't suffer fools. The team is losing at half-time. The ball's been getting kicked up to the winger, and the winger's losing the ball in the air. The opponent is out-jumping the winger and scoring tries. They're 3 down at half-time. So I'm behind the rugby coach in the changing rooms like this, and he's pacing up and down. You know, and I only know what's going to happen here. They come into the change room, and he says, "You," to the winger. He says, "You're getting beat in the air. He's beating you in the air, and it's costing us. Stop getting beat in the air." What has he just put him in? You're getting the point, threat state. He's just told him on what he wants him to avoid. So anyway, he finishes his talk, he sends them on the way, second half comes along, kick goes up, what happens? He gets beat in the air, we lose the game. He says to me at the end of the match, "How did I go?" I said, "Well, firstly, I would never have done it in front of the group. Great leadership tip, always praise people in public, but discuss areas to build on in person." I said, "I would have got him to one side and I would have said this: listen, he's up here, you're there, I want you to get an extra 2 foot on it, and I want you to take that ball, and you got me covered." What have I just put him in? A challenge state. Because the golden rule of thumb, whether it's with our children, our friends, our colleagues, our staff, you must communicate with people in terms of what you want them to achieve and make it instructional or offer advice. The minute we start communicating in a threat state way, we are triggering chaos in our organisation. We are putting people in that shutdown zone. Let me just also quickly whiz through now why we live in a world in 2018, and it's not to make anybody sort of worry, but we live in a world now more prone to a threat state than ever. And I think we've got a duty as employers, as leaders, and as parents to educate our people on what I'm about to say. If you think about pre-1918, our brain had social inputs from first and hand information only. We would have breakfast with our family, we would go to work, probably walk, we'd engage with 24 people, we'd come back, we'd have tea with our family, we'd go to bed. First-hand information, so it's calculated that we had 50 to 100 inputs in our brain a day. First-hand information, right? All could release a little bit of cortisol or whatever it might be. Fast forward, 1918 to 1975, the emergence of TV and radio. So now we didn't only have first-hand information, but we could now listen to world stories and news on the TV and on the radio. We could bring what was happening across the world to us. So our inputs into our brain increased to about 1,000 inputs a day. 1975 to 2000, the emergence of personal computers and the internet. Our brain started to become influenced by an unprecedented amount of information. We could access any news, any story, any information at the click of a button. It rose to 30,000 inputs a day. Now, all of these inputs, if you think about it, can release cortisol. They can send us unconsciously into a threat state. You've done it yourself, where you're scrolling through social media and you see something on terrorism or illness or cancer or whatever it might be. It's a slow release of cortisol in the brain. Fast forward to today, 2018, the emergence of smartphones and on-demand digital information at home and on our travels anywhere. Our brain, over 100 years, has increased to 100,000 inputs a day. That's 34 gigabytes. It's ridiculous. It's enough to fill a modern-day computer in a week. And we process that a day. Our kids, our 16, 17, 18-year-old kids, on iPads, on information, they can consume far more than we ever could. And each one of those inputs could trigger a release of cortisol. And we wonder why, at times, we've got the most anxious kids a generation has ever seen, right? So it's not all bad, because this modern day platform that we have gives us an enormous opportunity. We know that, but we've got to understand and interpret stress and cortisol release in the right way. We've got to stay in a challenge state. We've got to focus on what we want to achieve and make it instructional, and not on what we want to avoid. We do it with our kids. Stop doing that, chew your food, don't go near the road, stop doing this. And every time we tell them to avoid something, we're potentially triggering that threat state. It's something we have to think about. So coming up to my last few slides before I wrap up, certainly for this first talk of the evening, what is my point here and how can I stand up here and say what I'm saying? Well, Sjogren syndrome, how do I keep myself in challenge state? Because you can imagine, I went to the appointment to the rheumatologist and my wife, she's in the room. She's in the room this evening. She sat there and she's a worrier. She's a threat state person herself. She won't mind me saying that. And the doctor says, he gives us the diagnosis and he said, listen, Martin, there's a couple of things I've got to tell you. He said, the first thing is you will suffer the symptoms for the rest of your life, he said, because it's chronic. You can't cure autoimmune diseases. He said, so you'll suffer them for the rest of your life. And at first, me being nonchalant, I thought, well, I may have them for the rest of my life, but I'll decide if I suffer them. That was my first thought. The second comment he said blew me away. He said, I have to tell you this, but you have a 40% increased chance of developing non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, cancer. At which point, meltdown next to me, you know, she's having a meltdown and because she's in threat state. And now I'm Googling under the table the survival rates of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, 92%. So I'm going challenge state, right? So I've got a 92% chance of surviving something. I'm only 40% chance of getting in the first place. Challenge state, I'll take those odds. And that's genuinely how I operate with it. And I think the acknowledgement of it is what is the first step. I try to desensitize myself to the symptoms. If I told you for 7 days in a row I've had a headache and struggled with dizziness coming up to T2 talks, right? It's the truth. But I seem to be able to desensitize to it by accepting it and acknowledging it. And the last thing, and where I'm going to finish on, is this. I've got to start recognizing when I'm hitting the challenge and threat state crossroads, and I've got to intervene. And when I do one-to-one personal coaching, I've done a few with people in the room recently. When I do some personal coaching, I always teach them this technique, and I'm going to show it to you now. If I can recognize when I'm about to go in threat state, certainly when I'm having a Sjogren's flare-up, right? If I can recognize and I can intervene, and I can take challenge and not threat, I can go in one direction. How do I do it and what is it? So I'm going along my merry way and I hit the crossroads, which is the red dot. And I want to go here, challenge. I don't want to go what the other arrow would have been, into threat. There it is. I don't need to go there. So what do? I try and do 3 things to keep myself. And whenever you are worried, if you've laid awake at night worrying about things that you can't control, or if you're stressed about work or projects or whatever it might be, think about trying this. It's called the ABC technique. So the first thing is acknowledgement. I have to acknowledge and accept the worry and the stress and the threat state that's coming towards me. What do we do when we feel anxious and worried and when it comes in? If you're laid awake at night and you have things coming back into your head, what do you try to do? You try and push it away, don't you? What happens within 10 seconds? It comes back. And this is psychology. The more you push a worry away, the more it comes back. I'm okay with it. I don't wish I didn't have Sjogren's. I'm quite happy with it, right? I'm I'm not happy with it, but I'm quite accepting of it. I don't push it away. I acknowledge it. And I would implore you to do this. Acknowledge worries and stress. It is a normal human thing. It's a survival instinct. It's normal. We can interpret it as a challenge and not a threat. The second thing is breathing. Now, this is not some hippie, mindfulness, stand in the corner and start breathing deeply. But your physiology affects your psychology. And when we work with sportsmen and women, it's why you'll see them before a big kick or before a penalty or whatever. They take a deep breath, they moderate their breathing and they're slow. The military guys do this really well. I'll let Foxy comment on that. But they moderate their breathing and remain calm, which allows them to delay that sensory shutdown and move on to the third and final step, which is control. If you're a hypothetical worrier, only focus on the things you can control. What do I control in the here and now that's going to help me alleviate this worry in the future? A great tip in the night, if you can't get to sleep, have a pad and a pen on the side of the bed, wake up, write down 3 actions you're going to do the next morning, turn the light off. You watch how quick you go to sleep. Because as Dave said at the start, there is nothing more powerful than a decided mind. So the ABC technique works for me. It absolutely does. I'm speaking to kids in schools and in universities at the minute because I believe that the generation coming through are catastrophizing basic human stress. I checked in with Foxy because he's an ambassador on mental health, as we are at Trans2. And I think there's a lot going around at the minute around, it's okay to talk, it's okay not to be okay. I don't think it is. I think it's not okay to not be okay. And we need to start doing something about it, because if we're just labeling it as an illness, and there's different levels of mental health, don't get me wrong, but if we purely label it as an illness, we're taking any ownership away from the individual and the power they have in this as well. And for me, challenge or threat state is a conscious choice. It's the way we interpret the stress response. And if we educate our children and our work colleagues and our people, and we communicate to them in a challenge state way, we will drive more productive environments. We will build more resilience in our organisation. So reframing the threat into a challenge, and this is my last sort of comment of the evening. We've got to, if you are an individual in the room, stress and cortisol is a basic function of human existence. Embrace it. Understand that when you feel under the pump, or when you feel under stress, or when you feel worried or anxious about something, look at it, face it as a challenge. You know, understand it. I'm okay with this, but what am I going to do? Bring it back into the present, A, B, C, what do I control? And make some bloody decisions and start driving outcomes. Do not become the victim of it. For you, the leader in the room, if there's one thing you take from this, like I said, let it be this. Go back into your organisations and stop telling your people what they should be avoiding or what we don't want them to do. Does this make perfect sense? We get caught up in it, manufacturing, production, environments where we are saying we cannot afford, sales, we can't afford to miss target this month. Great, threat state in the team. You might drive an initial response, but at what cost? And finally, for the parents in the room like me, I think we have a duty to talk about this with our children and communicate in a way where they can take the control and focus on what they want to achieve. And if we do, we're going to make a huge difference in being able to get ourselves and other people in that challenge state. Ladies and gentlemen, have a wonderful evening, and thank you very much.